Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My dad invited me to his retirement dinner like it was some kind of privilege, as though this was the kind of event people should be grateful to attend, and he made sure to call me himself instead of having my stepmother pass the message along, which immediately told me there was a specific reason he wanted me there. The man hasn't given me a genuine compliment since I was a teenager, and even back then his praise came with a condition or a comparison, so if he's taking the time to buy me dinner in a nice restaurant, it's not because he suddenly decided to celebrate me or acknowledge anything I've done with my life. I knew before I even put the phone down that there was something else behind it, something transactional, and I also knew I was going to go, not out of some pathetic desire for his approval, because I let go of that fantasy years ago, but because I had my own reason for showing up, and that reason had the potential to make his entire night unravel in ways he could never have imagined. The truth is, my father has always had a very clear, very rigid way of seeing people, especially his own children. To him, there are winners and there are disappointments, and he decided early on which category each of us belonged to. My younger brother Matt, with his easy charm, constant smile, and the ability to turn any failure into a story that somehow made him the hero, was always in the winner column, no matter how many times he messed up. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the one who got decent grades without needing a tutor, who never caused trouble in school, who went to college and worked hard, and who somehow still never managed to be enough in his eyes. My successes were brushed off as expected, not worth celebrating, while Matt's smallest achievements were treated like proof of his brilliance. That imbalance stopped hurting a long time ago, but it never stopped being obvious, and I never stopped keeping score, not because I wanted to play his game, but because I wanted to know exactly when it was my turn to win. So when he called me that day, talking about how it was finally time to close a chapter and how family should be there for moments like these, I could hear the rehearsed pride in his voice, the kind he used when he wanted to make something sound warm while making sure it still had an edge. I said yes immediately, not giving him the satisfaction of hesitation, and I hung up already picturing the kind of smug little performance he'd put on in that restaurant. He would sit there, surrounded by people who had known him for years, talking about his career like it had been a mission from God, making speeches about hard work and sacrifice, and somewhere in that speech, there would be a shift, a moment when the smile on his face would sharpen, and he'd turn his words into a public announcement of whatever decision he thought would define his legacy. I knew exactly what that decision was, because Matt had already let it slip months earlier. We'd been at my stepmother's birthday party, and he'd had a few drinks, enough to get careless. He told me, with that same self-satisfied grin he's worn since we were kids, that Dad had finally done the paperwork, and that everything, the house, the investments, the vacation property in Florida, was going to him. Not to us. To him. When I asked why Dad would make a choice like that, he shrugged like it was the most natural thing in the world and said, "Because I'm the one who'll carry on the family name." I remember standing there, holding my drink, and feeling a wave of cold move through me, not because I cared about the money, but because it was such a perfect, unfiltered confirmation of how little my father valued me. But here's the part Matt didn't know. By the time he said those words, my own plan was already in motion. I had been working quietly, deliberately, for over a year on something far bigger than whatever inheritance Dad thought would hurt or humiliate me. It had started as an idea I wasn't even sure I'd pursue, but every time Dad dismissed something I said or treated my accomplishments like footnotes compared to Matt's half-hearted efforts, I felt more certain that this was the move I needed to make. By the time the retirement dinner invitation came, my plan was not only in place, it was complete. I was holding something that could cut deeper than anything my father had ever thrown my way, because it went right to the one thing he valued more than family, more than appearances, more than even his own comfort. You see, my father's entire identity, the way he measured his own worth, was tied to the company where he had worked for over 40 years. He talked about it as if it were his life's work, as if every promotion, every project, every win for that business was proof that he had done something meaningful in the world. It wasn't just a job for him. It was the thing that made him feel important. And I had just taken it. Not metaphorically. Not in the sense of working there or having influence there. I mean, I owned it. Every last share. So when I got dressed that night and walked into that restaurant, I wasn't the dutiful daughter coming to smile through another round of favoritism and subtle insults. I was the woman who had just pulled off the one move that could flip the power dynamic between us forever. He was expecting me to be blindsided by his big announcement, maybe even cry or leave in humiliation. But I was there to let him walk right into the trap without realizing it. And the best part? He had no idea. None. He was about to stand up in front of everyone he respected and deliver his little speech about leaving everything to Matt, thinking it would be the final word, the end of the story. But it wasn't. Because I was ready. I had been ready for months. And I knew exactly when and how I was going to drop the truth that would make his entire retirement celebration feel like the prelude to his own defeat. When I walked into that dinner, I already knew the script he was going to run, because I have heard versions of it my entire life. And it always follows the same beats where he warms the room with stories about sacrifice and grit, and then tilts the spotlight toward the person he wants to crown. So I sat there and let him do it, not because I was numb or trying to be noble, but because I wanted him to reach the peak of his little stage play before I touched anything, since the higher he climbed on his own ladder, the louder the fall would echo in his head afterward. He started with jokes that were really reminders of who held the authority, that careful tone older men use when they want to sound friendly while still making everyone at the table feel like they owe them a standing ovation, and people laughed, because they always do. And Matt laughed the hardest, because he always does, and I sat between them like the responsible ghost of family dinners past, nodding when it was polite and sipping water when it was not, letting the clock run because timing was the only thing that mattered. He talked about decades at the company as if he had built it with his bare hands, and even though I knew the details better than he did at this point, I kept my face steady, because I did not come to correct his mythology, I came to retire it. And that is a very different mission, so I let him tell the same war stories he has told every holiday, and I let the older guys at the table thump his back and tell him he deserved a victory lap, and I watched Matt soak in the reflected glow like a plant that has never once made its own sunlight. When the check was still far away and the speeches were finally winding down, he cleared his throat in that theatrical way he uses whenever he wants the room to understand that now comes the meaningful part, and he reached for my stepmother's hand like a prop. And I felt the whole place lean forward without actually moving, because everyone knew he was about to say the thing he had been waiting to say since he ordered the reservation. He announced that the estate was settled, that it was simple and efficient, and exactly what any practical man would do to protect the family name, and he said Matt's name with that proud little lift he never uses when he says mine. And even though I had known this was coming since the night my brother slipped after 2 drinks and bragged about it, hearing it in public carried a different sting, not because I wanted what he was giving away, but because he wanted the sting, and that is what told me everything about the man I was dealing with. I felt the room check my face for cracks, the way people do when they want to confirm a story about who you are, and instead of letting the silence turn me into the punchline, I reached for my glass and told him, in the same even voice you use when you confirm a reservation, that I appreciated the clarity and that it made my own decision easier, which changed the air at the table in a way he did not expect, because he had counted on the tears and the exit, not the calm and the smile. He tried to recover by explaining that it was not personal, that this was about legacy and simplification and the burden of managing assets, the kind of language men use when they want cruelty to sound like homework, and I nodded like a patient, bored accountant, then added that I was relieved not to be listed anywhere, since the paperwork I had signed earlier in the week would have complicated probate anyway, and you could actually feel the confusion start to crawl up his posture, because that sentence did not fit the script he had practiced, and when Matt asked what paperwork I meant, I told him I would send him a note later tonight, which turned the tiniest smile on his face into something tight and nervous. Because I refused to give his announcement the ending he wanted, the table began to shrug and talk about dessert, which left him stranded in the spotlight he had built for himself, and that was the first small win of the night, not the big one, but the kind that tells the audience this is not the movie they thought they were watching, and while people motioned for coffee, I stood up and asked for the check before he could do his big patriarchal gesture, and when the server brought it, I handed over a card with the name of my holding company on it, a clean, boring name that only means something if you happen to have spent a lifetime worshipping another name on a different set of documents. He saw the printing on the card while pretending not to, and I watched the first flicker of recognition cross his eyes, because even if he could not place it, he knew it belonged to a world that could touch his own, and that was the second win, quiet and surgical. Which is the only way to play a man. Who cares more about control than love? Matt leaned over and hissed that I did not have to make a show of paying, and I told him I was not making a show at all. I was simply closing a tab that was never mine to begin with. And then I did something small that probably looked petty from the outside, but felt perfectly calibrated on the inside, because it announced a new status without breaking a single rule. I tipped extremely well under my name, then looked my father in the eye and thanked him for excluding me from decisions about the family, since it freed me up to make decisions about my future without needing to consider his feelings. People went quiet in that polite, confused way that adults do when they realize the subtext is not a whisper but a fully formed sentence, and Matt's wrist twitched the way it always does when he realizes he does not understand the game he is playing. Before we left the table, I leaned toward my brother so only he could hear me, and I gave him one short line. Not dramatic, not cruel, just precise enough to do the work I needed it to do, and it knocked the grin off his face so fast he had to cough to cover it, because he suddenly understood that the finish line he had been bragging about was not the finish line at all, and that the race had been moved to a different track he did not know how to run. I will not repeat the exact words yet, because they belong to the moment they were built for, but I will tell you this much. By the time he looked back up at my father, the celebration had turned into a question mark, and by the time the server returned with the receipt, the question mark had turned into worry. Tomorrow, when he opened his phone and saw what I sent, he would understand why the calm smile never left my face, and he would finally realize that the announcement he cheered for tonight had already expired. People love to tell themselves that the most dangerous decisions are spontaneous, that revenge is something hot and immediate, but the truth, at least in my life, is that the real power sits in patience and paperwork. So while my father spent years rehearsing speeches about sacrifice and lineage, I spent months learning the language that actually moves the earth under men like him, which is not poetry or family lore but ownership structures, voting rights, debt covenants, and the quiet pathways through which influence gets converted into signatures that cannot be undone once the ink is dry. I did not start with a vow or a meltdown. I started with a question that would sound boring to anyone who needs drama to feel alive, which was simply this: if the company is the altar he worships at, who actually lights the candles, who cleans the floor, who keeps the doors open when the lights are off, and who would sell a piece of that altar if they were tired or under pressure and thought no one was watching? I knew the company's legend because I grew up hearing it, but legends blur the details. So I did the work my father always assumed I would avoid by drilling down into cap tables and board minutes and the history of every acquisition they made over the last decade. Then I mapped the personalities behind the titles, because institutions do not move unless people move first, and people do not move unless something pushes them. There was a retired founder's widow who held a small but meaningful block of non-voting shares that could be converted under the right circumstances. There was a regional bank carrying paper on a stalled expansion that looked less heroic once interest rates climbed. There was a senior vice president with a grievance and a divorce who had the kind of private stress that turns loyalty into caution. There was a family trust created 2 generations ago that had always voted with management but had never actually been asked if that was still their stance in a world where the next generation barely knew the chief executive's name. I did not walk in with a briefcase and a speech. I walked in with coffee and a pen, and I asked real questions, and I was patient when people needed time, and I never once mentioned my father's name, because the fastest way to lose a deal is to make it about your feelings. I built a small holding company with a bland, forgettable name, and I started layering, not because I wanted to hide anything illegal, but because anonymity is the only shield that keeps men like my father from sniffing out a move before it is ready to stand. And I hired a lawyer who has seen every version of family drama and therefore refuses to be tempted by the thrill of gossip. And I paired him with a woman who ran diligence like a war nurse, quiet and relentless, who could smell a bad clause from a mile away, and who taught me exactly how to ask for the one amendment that unlocks the gate without sounding like I am asking for anything at all. The first purchase was tiny and looked meaningless, which is the safest way to start. The second purchase came from the widow, who did not care about the company's grand story and only cared that someone finally explained, in plain language, what her options meant for her grandchildren. The third and fourth came from small funds that had bought in during a growth year and now wanted out without losing face. The fifth was the real shift, the one that moved me from curiosity to leverage, because it gave me the ability to force a conversation at the board level without revealing my hand. At any point I could have told myself that this was petty or that I should go to therapy and let it go, but every time I picked up the phone and a man explained something to me that I had just explained to him, or every time my father made an offhand comment about how I was sensible while practically weeping over Matt for remembering to call him on a Tuesday, the doubt thinned out and the plan sharpened, and I stopped framing it as revenge and began to see it as simple alignment, where the person who actually understands value should control the thing that creates it. The final stroke was the debt. The company had taken on a line of credit to fund an expansion that made sense when money was cheap but now looked like a slow leak, and there was a clause, buried in a supplemental agreement, that allowed the credit to be repackaged and sold, and I learned, through someone who owed me a favor from a completely different part of my life, that the bank was open to moving that paper if it could do so quietly at a small discount. I bought the debt, which gave me the right to sit at the table with the sort of polite authority that shuts down grandstanding, and within weeks a board member who had been holding on out of habit decided to take my offer, and then another followed, and then a third. And now I was not just a shareholder, but the person everyone called first. The deal closed 3 days before the dinner, which is a sentence I keep replaying because of how cleanly it sealed the timing, and when I say closed, I do not mean a rumor or a handshake. I mean final signatures and wire confirmations and a tidy document that names my holding company as the owner of the entity that sits on top of the operating company, which means I do not need to smile for anyone to exercise control. I only need to issue instructions. I sat alone in my kitchen when the confirmation came through, and I felt a complicated wave that I will not dress up as triumph, because it was not, at least not in the fireworks sense. It felt like the moment after you finally move a couch that has been blocking the door, when you realize you could have left the room at any time if you had believed yourself sooner. I did not call anyone, I did not post. I did not even open a bottle of anything. I just sent 2 messages. One to my lawyer confirming the press language I wanted ready if I decided to go public, and one to Matt, the line I mentioned at dinner, the one that was short and plain and built like a key, which said that an announcement would be made this week that might affect how Dad talks about legacy, and that if he wanted to prepare a response, he should check the state filings in the morning under corporate changes for entities related to the company's holding structure. He wrote back with a lazy, "What are you talking about?" that read like a man who thinks the ground is permanent, and I let it sit because tomorrow was going to do the talking for me, and I needed my sleep more than I needed his confusion. The morning after the dinner, right on schedule, the public record updated with a name that looks boring until you notice that it points to me, and my phone started buzzing with numbers I did not recognize, which I ignored for a while because the point was never the noise, it was the control. By lunch, I had an email from a board member I had never met who congratulated me in the indirect way cautious people do, and by mid-afternoon I had exactly what I needed, a simple, incontrovertible announcement drafted in neutral language that would travel fast through the circles my father reads like scripture. I did not intend to blast it with crowd or confetti. I intended to put it somewhere precise, to let it land where his pride lives, and to make sure that, when he read it, he would understand that the thing he used to define me out of the family is now the thing that defines him out of authority. I chose the room, set the time, and sent 2 invitations without names, only a subject line that said new ownership update, and then I waited, because sometimes the most satisfying move is not the loud reveal at dinner, it is the quiet, undeniable line on letterhead that makes a man who loves control feel the one feeling he has never allowed himself in front of me, which is helpless. Tomorrow, he would walk into a space he thought belonged to him and see mine instead, and that is where I planned to say the one sentence I had been rehearsing for months, not to humiliate him, but to finally, calmly, end his story about who gets to be the real heir. I booked a small conference room with plain walls and terrible coffee because I did not want the setup to carry any drama that might compete with the point. Then I sent a short agenda to a handful of people who actually matter in the life of a company even though they are rarely invited to the front of the room, which meant a representative from the bank who lives inside the credit documents, the operations lead who knows the truth about margins when the sales guys are done bragging, the human resources head who keeps the pension plan from becoming a headline, and 2 board members who have always claimed they value continuity more than personality. And I put my name at the bottom next to a phrase that is impossible to misread when you have spent years treating letterhead like scripture, which was simply new majority ownership update, effective immediately, and then I turned off my phone and waited. Because people who live on control always show up early, and I wanted them to feel the quiet before the door opened. The plan was not to give a speech or bask in attention, because I am not my father and attention has never been my oxygen. The plan was to state the facts in a voice that did not shake. Outline the first 3 policies that would signal an end to the old myth without humiliating the people who built the place, and then leave enough space in the air for the news to travel to the exact ears I needed. Since gossip is both cheaper and more accurate than any press release when the audience is proud. Men who read trade journals like scripture. I started with the only sentence that mattered, which was that the holding company I own had completed an acquisition that transferred control of the parent entity, and that, as of that morning, operational directives and strategic decisions would route through my office, which is not a flourish but a pipe, and once you install a new pipe, the water moves where you send it. And I could see on the faces around the table the small math that people do when they realize a change is real, the flicker of loss followed by the reflex to survive, and I respected it, because I did not come to scorch the ground. I came to fix the way power has been hoarded and sentimentalized in a family that confuses legacy with entitlement. I said there would be no mass layoffs, because I do not believe in using fear as a management tool, but there would be clarity about costs, because no one should lose their job so that a grown man can keep a vanity project alive. And I said we would be freezing executive perks that have nothing to do with performance, which meant the cars, the country club reimbursements, and the travel that has always looked suspiciously like vacation with a meeting stapled to it. The operations lead nodded in the way people do when they are too tired to celebrate. The human resources head exhaled like a person who finally sees a map, and the bank representative asked exactly the right question about covenants and reporting cadence, which I answered with the kind of detail that lets a cautious man go back to his desk and tell his risk team that the lights are on. I would be lying if I said I did not enjoy the next part, which was purely administrative, but felt like a very precise line drawn in ink, because I handed out 3 letters with simple titles. One confirming a temporary pause on non-essential capital expenditures pending review, one appointing the operations lead as interim chief operating officer with actual authority instead of a fancy title with no teeth, and one rescinding a ceremonial consulting arrangement that had been promised to a retired executive who is, coincidentally, one of my father's drinking buddies. And as I said those words, I thought about how many times I have watched men treat money like a private thank you note to their friends, and how boring and expensive that habit is when you see it up close, and I felt a clean kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with correcting a crooked frame. I ended with a short statement for external circulation that described the transition as orderly and forward-looking, and I left a blank where a quote from the new owner would normally go, because sometimes silence is the loudest sentence you can write. The door opened before I finished the last paragraph, and if I said the timing surprised me, I would be lying, because I had arranged the invite so that a copy would be forwarded, through predictable channels, to the 2 men most likely to treat a confidential notice like a dare, and they did not disappoint. Since my father walked in first with that practiced look of offended authority and Matt shuffled behind him trying to look like the adult he plays in his own head while still checking the corners for approval, and the board members shifted in their chairs the way people do when the past barges into the present without knocking. I did not stand up, not out of disrespect, but because I do not owe them the theater, and I simply said we were in the middle of a scheduled update and that if they wanted to stay they would need to listen. To which my father replied with the same low chuckle he uses when he wants to belittle without using an actual insult, and he asked what kind of game I thought I was playing, because in his head companies our temples and daughters are ushers, and I pointed to the first page of the packet in front of him and told him this was not a game, it was a change in ownership, and that he was welcome to read it before he lectured me about the rules. He scanned the header, saw the holding company name that meant nothing to him until it did, and his face did not crumble the way a movie would stage it. It just stopped moving for a second as his brain ran the same small math everyone else had run a few minutes earlier, and then he asked the only question he had left, which was how, and the answer was so boring that it must have hurt. Because the answer was through the same channels he has admired his whole life, which are called contracts, and I said it without heat or triumph, just a simple fact that resists argument. Matt tried to jump in with something about family, which would have been sweet if it were not so opportunistic, and I stopped him with a line that I had promised myself I would use only once, calmly and without raising my voice, which was that family is not a get-out-of-consequences card, and that he would understand this better when the documents I emailed him last night finished loading in his inbox. The room had gone so quiet the HVAC sounded like it was trying to apologize, and one of the board members, the one who used to lecture me about patience at holiday dinners, cleared his throat and asked my father if he wanted to sit, which was a professional courtesy and also a small funeral for the version of him that used to walk into rooms like this and expect applause. I ended the meeting with a simple instruction, which was that the external statement would go live in 1 hour on the company site and on the wire, that the pension plan was secure, that a listening session with department heads would happen this week, and that until further notice I am the person of contact for strategic decisions, and then I thanked everyone for their time, because civility is free and I like to spend it generously when men expect me to throw plates. My father stayed in his chair as the room emptied, which is a thing I will remember much longer than any speech he has ever given, and he finally said, very quietly, that I had no right to do this to him, and I told him, equally quietly, that I had not done anything to him, I had done something for myself, and then I gave him the line I had kept in my pocket since the night Matt bragged, the line that snaps the cord clean without showing a drop of blood, which was that his decision to leave everything to my brother did not matter anymore, because I had just bought the only thing he ever truly loved, and now I would decide how it lives. He stared at me in a way that used to make me feel 12 and small, and I stared back like a woman who pays her own bills and reads her own contracts, and he finally asked what I planned to do with his legacy, which is the question I wanted on the table when we were alone, because the answer is not a paragraph, it is a move, and I had been waiting to make it until this exact second. Since nothing lands harder than a signed document placed between a man and the story he tells about himself, and that is exactly what I slid across the table as the door clicked shut behind the last witness, a document whose first sentence would make him understand why tomorrow morning was going to feel like the end of a very long chapter. The document I slid across the table was not theatrical or decorated with anything that would let him claim it was about humiliation rather than structure, since what it contained was a clean, enforceable resolution adopted by the board that morning through the authority I now held. And it did 3 very simple things that, taken together, removed the last place where he could pretend his story still controlled the room. Because first it converted a controlling block of equity into an employee ownership trust that would vest over a series of measured years for the people who keep the place running when no one is giving speeches. Second, it instituted a strict anti-nepotism policy at all management levels, including a ban on advisory contracts for immediate family. And third, it transferred all naming rights and promotional references tied to individual executives into a neutral house style that recognizes teams instead of patriarchs, which means the slogans about single heroes would be retired quietly, The plaques would be rewritten, and every future brochure would point to departments and outcomes rather than last names. And by the time his eyes reached the second page, the color had left his posture, because he understood that while I had not taken money from his pocket, I had taken the part he values more than money, which is the right to be treated like a monument in a place he only ever rented with his time. He read the section that established a scholarship fund under my grandmother's name for the children of employees who want to study accounting, logistics, or skilled trades. And I watched his mouth tighten at the detail that the first tranche was already funded and the selection committee was insulated from executive influence. And when he got to the clause that required any consultant to disclose family relationships within 2 degrees, he sat back like a man who just found out the map ends sooner than he thought, which is exactly the feeling I had carried for years while being told to be sensible and patient, while my brother, with his permanent grin and a resume written in crayon, was promised a future he had not earned. He asked whether I had any idea what this meant for him, not in a financial sense, because he is not foolish, but in the story sense, the one where his name sits on invitations and he calls that legacy, and I said I knew exactly what it meant. Because it meant that the company he had used as his personal mirror would finally be what it should have been all along, which is a workplace and not a shrine, and I said it in the same steady voice I would use to read a policy out loud, since at this point heat would only distract from the point, and then I told him the sentence I had saved for last, the one I had promised myself I would only say when it could end a chapter instead of start a fight, which was that his decision to leave everything to my brother did not matter anymore, not because I wanted his house or his accounts or his vacation spot, but because I now owned the place he loved more than all of that combined. And I had already decided that what he called legacy would be measured by pensions funded on time, promotions earned without back doors, and profits that do not get siphoned off to keep a fragile ego polished. And while I was talking, I watched the anger give way to something smaller and older, which looked a lot like the first time he realized I was not going to chase his approval around the room anymore. Matt tried to pivot into apology, his favorite late move when he senses a door closing, and he said we could work something out, which landed like a mosquito on a windshield. And I told him the only arrangement available was the public one written in front of him, where he is invited to apply for any open role he is actually qualified for with the same odds as anyone else, where interviews are recorded for compliance, and where references are checked like they should have always been. And he opened and closed his mouth a few times like he was testing words for sharp edges before swallowing them, because even he could see there was nothing to bargain with when the thing you thought you were promised now belongs to people who show up early and clock out late without a safety net. I signed the final page, initialed the annex that listed the first group of employees who would receive early trust units in recognition of time served through difficult years, and I pushed a second envelope across the table addressed to the pension administrator, authorizing an immediate audit and a top-up from discretionary funds, because the first move of any new era should make the right people feel safe. And he watched my pen move with the same focus he used to reserve for scorecards and holiday toasts, and I realized, with an odd calm, that we were finally in the same room but not playing the same game. When it was done, he asked if I was happy now, the kind of question people ask when they cannot imagine a version of success that does not look like a parade, and I told him I was not happy and I was not sad. I was simply finished with the part of my life where I treated his approval like oxygen, which does not mean I feel nothing, because feelings do not evaporate just because you win. It means that feeling is finally not the steering wheel. And he could take from that whatever dignity he wanted. I stood to leave, because I had a listening session with the warehouse crew that afternoon, and I do not like to keep people waiting who cannot afford to waste time, and he said my name in the way he used to when I was a girl who had to come back to the table. And I paused because I am not cruel, and he asked, very quietly, whether he would at least be invited to the scholarship ceremony, and I said it was not my event, it belonged to the committee and the families, and if they chose to include him, that would be their choice, which is another way of saying that the power to anoint had finally left his hands and found its way to the people who actually deserve to decide. On the way out, Matt asked if we could talk privately later, and I told him I would send him the link to the careers page and that I wished him luck, and I meant it without sarcasm. Because there is a difference between revenge that wants to see a person burn and justice that wants to see the rules finally apply, and I am not interested in flames, I am interested in order. That night my phone lit up with messages from cousins and old family friends who wanted the inside version, and I left them unread, because the only person whose opinion could still hurt me had already used up his balance. And the only people I owed an explanation to were the ones who would be here tomorrow making sure invoices match deliveries and that the payroll hits on time. I sat alone and thought about the girl who used to prepare answers in her head so that if he ever asked her what she wanted, she would sound smart and composed, and I let myself feel a small grief for the fact that we never got the version of father and daughter that makes holidays easy, and then I let it go, because what I did today does not fix the past, it builds a future where I do not need to prove I deserve a seat. You want to know if it was worth it, and I could dress the answer up or make it a sermon. But the truth is plain and heavy and sits exactly in the middle, which is that it was worth it because the right people will be safer. Because my brother will finally meet the same gravity the rest of us have lived under, and because my father will have to live with the knowledge that the one person he trained himself to underestimate was the person who wrote the final line of his favorite story. And yet, it will never feel like victory in the movie sense, because it is quieter than that, and it lives in the choices I make tomorrow and the week after that when no one is watching. I will not pretend it healed everything, and I will not apologize for how cleanly it landed. I wanted justice without cruelty. I wanted to win without becoming him, and I think I did, because when I turned off the light and went to bed, the last thought I had was not about him, and not about Matt, and not even about the company. It was about the first group of employees who will open a letter next month and learn that something they built now finally belongs to them a little more, which is the only legacy I care to leave, and if that makes me the villain in his version, then he can keep the story, because I have the ending.